welcome to our panel discussion on global conflict transformation, perspectives from India. My name is Karoline Eickhoff. I'm an associate researcher with the Berghof Foundation. This is our second event on global conflict transformation. In the first session, our panelists shared insights into South Africa's history of conflict and reconciliation, as well as South Africa's roles in security and peacebuilding on the continent. Today, we will delve into Indian perspectives on conflict transformation. Before we open the panel, I would like to very briefly recall the aim and purpose of these discussions. While many of our events are dedicated to sharing insights and lessons from our work, these discussions are dedicated to the idea of discovery. On the one hand, the sessions are inspired by ongoing debates on how knowledge is produced in our field of work, calling for more open-ended and exchange-oriented formats. At the same time, we observe that current political transformations at the global level result to some extent in governments and societies across the world becoming more polarized. These polarizations can have profound consequences for conflict transformation work. For example, some governments might issue more confrontational foreign security policies, which may in turn affect peacebuilding. With that said, we believe that engaging in mutual learning exercises across knowledge communities working within our fields can contribute to bridging those divides. We're delighted that outstanding speakers from India have agreed to join our panel today. They will be introduced shortly by our moderator, Professor Tobias Berger from Freie Universität Berlin. Tobias has conducted extensive research on Indian foreign policy and international relations, partly in cooperation with the Berghof Foundation. Tobias, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Karoline, and also a very warm welcome from my side to our audience. It is a great pleasure and honor to chair today's discussion on Indian perspectives on conflict transformation in a multipolar world. India is certainly a very central player in global processes of conflict transformation, yet one that is often curiously overlooked by European policymakers, as well as academics, I hasten to add. Gaining independence on the basis of nonviolent resistance to colonial rule, almost from its inception, the post-colonial Indian Republic contributed very substantially to international peacekeeping missions. Starting with the UN operation in Korea in 1950, India has deployed more than 2,000 personnel to UN-led peacekeeping operations around the world. At the same time, in its immediate neighborhood, India has been very heavily involved in the process of conflict transformation as well, for example, in the conflicts in Sri Lanka or Nepal. And also domestically, conflict transformation has been a very central concern. For example, in the context of armed politics in various parts of the country, or on struggles to transform structural violence emanating from deep-seated inequalities, for example, along caste or gender lines. In light of this rich and varied repertoire of experiences, I'm greatly looking forward to discussing Indian perspectives on and traditions of conflict transformation, their historical origins, their specific trajectories, their current trends, and last but certainly not least, the lessons they harbor for the wider peacebuilding and conflict transformation communities. I now have the honor to introduce our distinguished panel with whom we're going to discuss these questions and aspects. First of all, let me introduce Professor Priyankar Upadhyaya, who serves as the UNESCO Chair of Professor for Peace and Intercultural Understanding at the Banaras Hindu University, where he also heads the Malviya Center for Peace Research. He has done postdoctoral studies at London University and holds a PhD and MPhil degree from Jawaharlal Nehru University and an advanced international diploma in conflict resolution from Uppsala University. Amongst others, Professor Priyankar has served as senior fellow at the Peace Research Institute Oslo and as resource person for the UN University of Peace. He has served in various committees on the Indian government, including the Civil Service Examination Reform Committee and the National Mission on Education. Then I would like to welcome Professor Anjoo Sharan, who is also a professor at Banaras Hindu University at the Department of Political Science. She holds a PhD in political science from the same university and has over 40 years of teaching and research experience in India and abroad, including the London School of Economics, the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, D.C., and Brown University. Her areas of specialization are international relations, development, and gender studies. She engaged in various national and international research projects, among others a project called Peaceful Coexistence, Traditional and Non-Traditional Conflict Resolution Mechanisms by the German Foundation for Peace Research, with whom many of you are probably familiar. Then I would like to very warmly introduce as well Dr. Florina Xavier, who's currently a return and reintegration advisor at the NGO Act for Peace. After having worked in various international organizations, her areas of work now focus on project management, women and children, education, health and nutrition, livelihood, counseling, advocacy, peace building, and disaster risk reduction. Dr. Florina Xavier holds a PhD in social work from Osmania University and was awarded as a Fulbright Scholar and Oxford Fellow. In addition to her broad practical experience, she also lectured at Loyola College and Rhoda Ministry College of Social Work and Research in India. And she's joined by Professor Gladstone Xavier, who is an associate professor in the Department of Social Work at Loyola College in Chennai. He holds a PhD in social work from the same institution and was awarded as Fulbright Fellow. He's an expert in the field of conflict and peace building and has done substantive work providing training on trauma awareness and recovery, arts-based approaches to peace building, sustainable development, strategic planning and management, and restorative justice, as well as working with community-based organizations. He lectured very widely in Asia, Europe, and the Americas. Our four distinguished panelists are joined towards the end of the session by Janelle Galvanek, who is the head of the Sub-Saharan Africa unit at the Berghof Foundation. For the past 5 years, she has led the foundation's projects in Somalia, which support mediation and dialogue initiatives among local communities. Janelle's professional focus includes insider mediation, infrastructures for peace, engaging local actors in conflict transformation processes, the interaction between formal conflict resolution mechanisms and traditional conflict resolution mechanisms. So we have a very distinguished panel today with whom we're going to discuss and engage with Indian perspectives on conflict transformation. Before we dive into the discussion, let me very briefly outline a few technical issues pertaining to the procedure of the session today. So we will open the session with brief introductory statements by each of our four panelists. And then we open the floor to a broader discussion with you, with the audience. You can pose questions in two ways. Firstly, you can write your question in the chat, and please feel free to submit questions already during the opening statements. If they come to your mind, we will collect and post them after having heard all introductory statements by our panelists. You can pose questions either to individual panelists or to the panel as a whole. And secondly, you might also pose questions in person. To do so, please indicate this in the chat as well. And then we will let you know and bring you into our virtual room that you can directly address the session and ask your questions there. And then towards the end of the session, Janelle has kindly agreed to offer some concluding remarks and reflections on the implications and possible lessons of our discussions for the wider conflict transformation community as a whole. Okay, so without further ado, I'm delighted to hand the floor over to you, Professor Priyankar.
Well, thank you so much, Toby. And it's once again a privilege to work with colleagues from almost the entire globe, if we can say, from India to Germany and elsewhere in Europe. And especially Berghof Center, we have very sweet memories of working together. And then too, the idea was to discover the indigenous patterns of peace building, in a sense that there is as you know, an ongoing quest and a feeling that in many parts of the world that the peace and conflict studies, like other disciplines of social sciences, is under the spell of, or it still continues to be under the spell of Western knowledge systems, using the concepts, the way we look at peace process, etc., etc. And of course, everybody knows here about the reservations and the critiques of liberal peace building we are doing. So the project we did together, and Janelle was mentioning informally about it, you know, in Northeast state of India, that was just one little story about how this indigenous peace building can be conceptualized, and can we pose it, can we contrast it to the you know, top-down liberal peace building methods, and where does it all go? So you see, this is an ongoing process, but my task here is to tell you about the little efforts that we are making in India and elsewhere, also to understand the Indian perspectives of peace building, conflict transformation, whatever name you call it. Now, first of all, let me say that it's a very, very difficult task. I mean, covering and the very long and prolix lineage of Indian history and looking for the consistent patterns of peace ideas. But some of us have done it. I myself have been involved in writing a little bit and researching to see if we can provide or identify a set of values and standards as also perhaps, and this is important, the lived-in tradition of peacefulness that have endured the vast and varied tracts of India and continue to embellish the collective Indian consciousness. And I think this is what we have been trying to do. And that is where I would like to begin. My idea is to very quickly tell you about how some of us, many of us look at or would like to look at the Indian traditions and lineage, and then try to bring it, connect it to the different epochs of Indian history and bring it to the contemporary or the modern so-called post-independence concept. Now, first of all, many of us are concerned to highlight the peaceful ethos that comes out in a very strong measure in religious traditions, many religious traditions of India, particularly in Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, not to say that other religions do not have that kind of in their lived-in history. But let's quickly talk about the features. And some of the features that I have been highlighting, others have been highlighting, include a dialogical ethos, which is very essential. You know, dialogues are very essential for any kind of peace building processes. And a holistic concerns about peace. I mean, in Indian tradition, peace, you know, it's very normal and natural to talk about nature and ecology as an intrinsic component of peace building. I mean, the planetary concerns, I mean, this has come to us. And more importantly, the spirit of live and let live, you know, the peaceful coexistence, it reflects. Once again, it's an instrumentalist approach because there are contrary practices and ideas also, and which is like in any other culture, but this is what we kind of focus on. Now, also perhaps important is to, you know, think about the compatibility between the ideas of inner peace and social peace, which comes out so vividly in the life and work of Mahatma Gandhi. And even those who are not much familiar with the Indian history, Indian culture, or Indian complexity, if I can say, Mahatma Gandhi, I think, is perhaps the best bet. Everybody knows about his concern and his, you know, categoric commitment to non-violence. And a lot of contemporary authors and activists have drawn from him, and he continues to inspire. Now, many of the Gandhian ideas, I think, they had a kind of Wontenshung in the sense of worldview. Like he never approved of the so-called modern state apparatus as such. He said it can never be non-violent. He talked about Shanti Sena, the peace brigade. He said that instead of having an army for military purposes, perhaps he could talk about, you know, using or waging peace like war is waged. Then Satyagraha. In many of our university curricula, I think we teach Gandhian approaches to conflict resolution along with the Western approaches. But I would still say that, you know, we have yet to do the kind of a very clear focus on how to bring in the indigenous idea of peace building and peace research within the overall framework of conflict resolution and transformation. Very quickly about the post-independence India, you know, a very important feature of Indian foreign policy, and probably you're also interested to be about, you know, the Indian foreign policy aspect, was non-alignment. And mostly we looked at non-alignment as a response to Cold War, but there were very good studies and very good statements and idea, including that of John Burton, who wrote a book on non-alignment, saying that the Indian format of non-alignment can be transformative in the sense that it offers an alternative to power politics. And as you mentioned, that India did at that time, 50s, 60s, made an imprint in Korea, in Suez crisis, in so many other places. Nehru was a synonym in India's first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, I'm talking about 47 to 1964. So at that time, the Indian policy assumed a lot of value, full understanding of peacefulness, and talking about alternate visions. 70s onwards or 60s onwards, especially after the India-China conflict in 1962, which was a very sad aspect of the so-called post-colonial third world unity, we see a decline in not only non-alignment, but also in an avowed Indian commitment for peacefulness. We gradually started veering towards what we call is national security state. But even now, I should say, Indian society, Indian intellectual traditions, India has a lot to offer in terms of enriching the discourses on peace building in terms of dialogical tradition. Amartya Sen has written a lot about it, many others, of course, that how this dialogical tradition, the kind of a natural proclivity for diversity and dialogue and tolerance, these are derivatives that can enrich our understanding, and not to miss the practices that we try to highlight in our study on Northeast, that many of these practices are yet to get noticed. So there is a lot that can be said. And as I say that one has to really cast one's net very wide and at least speak for 5 hours to make a real cogent sense. But I would leave it here. And then, perhaps as the discussion takes hold, we can come back to these issues and many other issues which I have not preferred to include here. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Professor Priyankar, for this very rich yet nonetheless very succinct introduction to both pre-colonial traditions of conflict transformation and post-colonial trajectories of engagement in various conflicts. I would hand over the floor now to Professor Anjoo Sharan.
Thank you, Professor. Am I audible enough? Okay, so first of all, a big thank you to you all, to Berghof Foundation, to the organizers this evening for inviting us to participate in what we from the South perceive as a celebratory evening, to celebrate the work that we have done, some of us have done together. And of course, as you rightly said, to look at the future prospects as where we can go from here. Since Professor Upadhyaya has actually talked in detail, or rather, highlighted with broad brush, the various international dimensions and some of the domestic dimensions of conflict transformation, I would prefer to focus my opening remarks on something that has mostly been hidden from the international political scientists, so to speak, and that is the domestic challenges that we all face. And we all have, tried since the time we were not even independent during the freedom struggle to attempt at reconciling those conflicts, at transforming those conflicts and accommodating and producing a new culture, so to speak. My focus this evening would be on those segments of the society that have been traditionally, either marginalized or ignored or discriminated or excluded, and the various initiatives that the Indian leadership, as well as the masses and the elite and the academics and the activists have taken to, bring forth these challenges and to invent those diverse and innovative techniques to resolve those differences, to be more accommodative, to be more inclined towards justice. I'm hinting at the various segments that are addressed as the Dalits of India, the tribals, the minorities, mostly read as Muslims, and of course women, that cuts across all these segments. And there's a very strong intersectionality that gets roped into this all. I'll not go into history, there's not enough time here, but just a very quick glance at how even towards the end of the 19th century, there were women leaders who were very perceptive about the discriminatory treatment that was given out to them. And they wrote wonderful texts identifying those discriminations. And this was later on picked up in the early 20th century by the leaders and by those who were in position of till then, comparative power, to bring forth this discrimination, which then got incorporated in the Constitution. And quite similarly, other segments also followed. For instance, the caste discrimination that is generally looked upon as very peculiar to India, but in some form or the other has been very global. I mean, I can expatiate upon it if there are questions on that. There has been discrimination all across on one ground or the other, be it race or color or ethnic origin, and so on and so forth. And that is probably the reason that it has found manifestation, even the SDGs, to put a stop to these discriminations. So when the Constitution of India was incorporated in 1950, we find that the Constitution is emphasizing on stopping this discrimination. And there have been various techniques through which this has been done. So this evening, maybe when we get chance after the initial opening discussions, one would like to talk about the directive principles of state policies that talks about stopping discrimination. One would like to talk about the various policy initiatives that have been taken up by the government at different points of time in our modern history, the initiatives that the activists through the civil society organizations have taken, the preferential policies that have been adopted. And, in various ways, there have been almost like a constant work in progress as to how to reduce discrimination, how to be more inclusive. And there have been various tools for this. For instance, we talk about the traditional modes of conflict resolution. Yes, according to the Indian Constitution, our civil codes have incorporated the traditional modes of asserting authority and entitlement to people. We can talk about women getting what we say is a stridhan, and there are various n number of examples to ensure this. And same is true of the affirmative action policies that India has been taking towards the Dalits, that is the seemingly the previously untouchables, how to make them better educated, how to have quota system for them, how to incorporate them into the civil society. And so there has been a constant innovation, shuffling and reshuffling of the cards, as we say. But the normative standard has been to bring about justice and equality and inclusion and peace. So these are my initial, takes on that, and we will, take it from there as and when the interest of others comes forward. Thank you so very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Anjoo, for this really, really rich and insightful opening remarks. They certainly really sparked my interest, not least because I recently worked on the life and work of Hansa Mehta, an educationalist and diplomat who was very engaged and very influential in struggles against discrimination, both in India and globally. So I'm delighted that you pick up this really rich intellectual tradition of activism there as well. I would like to hand the floor over now to Dr. Florina Xavier.
Thank you so much, Professor Tobias. And thank you so much, Berghof Foundation, for organizing this. And it's an honor to be among esteemed professors this evening. I'm going to share my 2 pence worth. I'm from the field, so I will bring in the field aspect of it. I've been working with refugees for quite some time, and peacebuilding has been one area that we have been looking into. I would like to imagine, would want you to imagine, peacebuilding like a ball, yeah. And three aspects of it that I'll be talking about today is, one is to keep asserting your rights, yeah. So peacebuilding is not about saying, okay, fine, we all have to be happy. It's not that. It's about we continue fighting for our rights. So that's asserting our rights. The other aspect is development. We want to make sure that people's lives have a path that they can, walk on. So development. And the third aspect is healing, because out of war comes a lot of trauma and a lot of victims. So these three aspects is something that I'm thinking of. And when we look at asserting rights non-violently, my context is working with India and Sri Lanka. And 2009, the war ended in Sri Lanka. However, the refugees in India are just trickling back. We've had about 15,000 refugees who have gone back in the last 10 years. But there are people who are willing to go. Unfortunately, COVID has played spoil sport. So there's a struggle with that. So working on both sides of the Park Strait, India and Sri Lanka, we're looking at preparing people for return in India and reintegrating them. Now, in all of this, peace building definitely is a common aspect. After the war ended in Sri Lanka, we had to do a lot of work on creating awareness among the refugees about what happened in Sri Lanka. So the aspect of asserting rights non-violently or establishing that it is not over is about making them aware of what happened and all of the challenges that they had faced in Sri Lanka, especially children who are born in India, but also for when they go back, how will they assert their rights? So the creating awareness, getting them to know about the history and culture, especially when they are in India, they have no idea about Sri Lanka, the context, or especially children who are born in India, people who left there many years ago. 35 years as refugees is not a short time. So that is another aspect of working with history and culture when it comes to asserting rights and telling them what happened. And with development, we're looking at two areas. We're looking at education and livelihood. And education, again, peace education is a major aspect in schools, bringing in culture of peace, but talking to children in Sri Lanka and also in India about what it is to have a peaceful society. So education, but also ensuring that people are educated, because lives of refugees could be, years can just go by. So ensuring that. And livelihood is an important aspect, because when they don't have anything to do, when they don't have employment, when they don't have opportunities, then people are thinking of other things to do. So getting them engaged, getting them active and working. So livelihood becomes an important aspect when it comes to development. And with development, a lot of other things on infrastructure and all of that should be built. One interesting area that probably many of you will not be aware of is that many of them don't have documentation, they don't have certificates, they don't have citizenship to say that they're Sri Lankans. So to work on those aspects is an important area. And the last and final one, healing, a very, very important aspect, because yes, you may be fighting for your rights. Yes, you may have a lot of development, but if you're not healed, if you're not ready, then the trauma continues and you're not able to lead complete lives. So when it comes to healing work related to relationship building, we do a lot of work on building psychosocial support relationships in the camps, but also in Sri Lanka, working to heal people, talking about the trauma that they have been through. Despite being 35 years, people still remember the raw facts of when the war was waged. So to help them to work with that. So we do a lot of work on that. And in Sri Lanka, also looking at social cohesion projects, where we try and bring people together. We bring the Sinhalese, the Tamils, the Muslims, the Christians. So bringing people, the Hindus together for dialogues, even among the Tamils itself who are returning, to talk to the internally displaced people, to talk to the returnees, to talk to those who have just remained wherever they are during the war. So bringing people together is an important aspect of our work in among the Sri Lankans in Sri Lanka when it comes to healing. So just going back, three aspects of peace building. We're looking at asserting rights, development, and healing. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing this perspectives from the field and from the everyday engagements in process of conflict transformation with us. Last but certainly not least, I would like to hand the floor over now to Professor Gladstone.
Thank you. It is always difficult to talk after such luminaries and the wonderful people after hearing these wonderful people talk. Of course, there's a lot left, but definitely they've said a lot in terms of theoretical framework, conceptualization, context, and then coming to a practical experience. I'm kind of a mix, a hybrid between an academic with a serious problem of fieldwork. So a fieldworking academic that's how I like to define myself. Now, given that definition, it's definitely a wonderful opportunity, and thanks to Berghof, who I worked with in Sri Lanka for a long time. Most of my briefings with Berghof during the conflict, during the war, I used to use the mouth of Berghof to bring out some of my ideas, because it was too risky for me to talk about it when I was working there. Berghof was the shield, and they would give me that space to do that. So thanks to Berghof for doing that and doing some great work. Now in India, I am going to talk about this whole tradition that we have to contribute. The pretext behind it is, if you want peace, you have to work for justice. And how do you work for justice? The Indian way, of course, we have the maestro of nonviolence, Mahatma Gandhi, who perfected it and moved it in that direction. In post-independent era, a number of people have actually picked up the thread. Even during the life and times of Mahatma Gandhi in South India, you have the big tradition of E.V. Ramasamy Periyar, who, when he wanted to assert the rights, be it women's rights, be it issues of caste or religion or politics, there was never resortment to any kind of violence, but rather the use of sharp intellect and wit to overcome that. Books that he's written, Why Did a Woman Become a Slave, for example, like that. And then when we look at another icon who's more relevant than anybody else in India today is Ambedkar. And Ambedkar's teachings, philosophy was based on Buddhism. Now, the Buddhist ideas are very, very relevant today, where even when we protest peacefully. And even when we want to say something very harsh, we say it in a way it doesn't hurt. And then when we want to have a very difficult conversation, we use humor. Now, like that, life has been a struggle, especially when I work in the grassroots communities a lot. In this post-COVID scenario, I see that there is very little difference between the approaches of Ambedkar, Gandhi, and Periyar. There's very little difference in the approach. There are ideological differences. There may be philosophical differences, but in terms of approaches, there's very little difference. Now, I would like to bring in Karl Marx also inside. The use of Karl Marx in theory, and there were contradicting ideas. Ambedkar himself wrote a book, Buddha or Marx, or Dhamma versus Marx. And he clearly looks at these intersectionalities between them. So today we are talking about these intersectionalities of peace building, which give us an opportunity and scope not to restrict us into an ideological framework, or whether it is Gandhi, or whether it is Nehru, or whether it is Ambedkar, or Periyar, or most recently Sundarlal Bahuguna, who just passed away recently, or anybody else, or Chipko movements, or the Vinoba Bhave. All these people, what they have done is they have passed on the torch to the next generation. And today we can see, even after half a year, the peaceful protest of the farmers is continuing to happen in the north. The peaceful protest of people in the south against the hydrocarbon issue is still continuing. 3 years of peaceful protest against the nuclear movement in the south continues to go on. Now, these are traditions that have somehow been ingrained in the justice framework of India. Having said that, where do we theorize it? Should we look at the West for theories, or should we look at West for practice? It needs to be a merger. Sadly, because we don't write, it does not mean we don't have theories. Sadly, because very few people are endowed with the time and resources to move ahead, these issues are not coming out. Whereas when we look at what India has contributed to the last century, the whole century of nonviolent resistance, that's the previous century, and moving on into technological nonviolence in this century is a great contribution that comes from the foundations that were laid centuries ago. It may be religious discrimination, we fight it religiously. It can be a sociological discrimination, we fight it again sociologically. So you take it out with them. Only thing is, as somebody said, the tools are different. The tools we use, the way we engage are different. There are some takeaways very interesting takeaways from the recent protests. First is using very innovative techniques have India has taught that to be very innovative and creative. Second is use of technology today to create a critical mass towards peace. Third is also you have to confront controversiality with a justice framework. So you have to be controversial. So when you are controversial, it is important today in this context where we are being polarized by religion, by caste, by different belief systems. The polarization is really becoming extreme. And that's when we are all called and challenged around the world to take these examples of coexistence and looking at positive, peaceful experiences from our own areas. So today, young people are joining hands with all generations, and there is a continuing search for peace, and people want to get involved. Most recently, in the COVID scenario, we saw a humanitarian tsunami, a surge of volunteerism coming up. And this surge of volunteerism is also moving towards asserting rights non-violently. And we have seen that repeatedly. And so when I look at these examples, there are plenty of examples. And when I look at these examples, I see hope. I see that the masters of destruction don't stand a chance in front of the small, minuscule actors of peace. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There's probably no better and more beautiful way of ending this round of introductions with this emphasis on hope and on the possibility for, well, improvement and resistance against the masters of destruction. A field-working academic, I also like that very, very much. So thank you so much, Professor Gladstone, for this very moving and very interesting account that connects philosophical traditions and thoughts of Ambedkar and Gandhi and Nehru to the grassroots experiences, including up to today's protests. Now, I think these were all really interesting and thought-provoking statements. I certainly have a lot of questions, and I'm really tempted to abuse my position as chair to ask the first couple of questions, but I think this would be incredibly impolite and rude. So I try to refrain myself and just check with my colleagues if we have the first questions coming in. All right. Let me see. Is there anybody in the chat who wants to? Okay, so we have a first question, which is, given its historical background and the principles of nonviolence adopted during the Indian independence, India could have played a greater role in mediating the Sri Lankan conflict. However, it was viewed as a missed opportunity for India, where Norway played a crucial role in mediating the LTTE and Sri Lankan government than the huge neighbor, India. All right, so I think this is like a question going to the engagement of the Indian state in conflict transformation processes in its immediate neighborhood. And I think this like really kicks us off into a direction of discussion that I would also like to embark upon with some further questions. But maybe first I hand over to Dr. Florina to illuminate a bit more the different roles of different Indian actors in solving successfully or not so successfully conflicts in Sri Lanka.
Thank you so much for that question. Yeah, it is true that India could have played a bigger role. India could have taken up the role in different ways, but at different points, India took probably a laissez-faire or a backward role. And I would think now, working post-conflict, working with refugees, I would think that probably India is being more proactive in the refugee cause now, especially when it comes to working with the people in its own country, the refugees that they're taking care of. Given the different situations in Sri Lanka, changing governments in Sri Lanka, it is also challenging for India. Again, the different governments in India to take up the cause. But I'm not going to justify and say that what India did is right. I personally, again, this is a personal opinion, I feel that India could have been more proactive. And I also saw the other thing on the Indian peacekeeping force. Yes, there has been, especially having been to Sri Lanka several times, there's a lot of anger about the Indian peacekeeping force in Sri Lanka. Intentions from India's side may have been genuine to have sent people there too, but however, it backfired, did not turn out as expected, and a lot of internal conflict. So I would just like to say that I also think that India could have played a bigger role and could have handheld Sri Lanka, given that it's a small island next to us. And I am from Tamil Nadu, so there was a lot of protesting in Tamil Nadu against the government of India itself when government of India wasn't responding. I still remember end of the war, the whole of the entire state came to a standstill saying that we should do something about it. So yes, but that is why the aspect of reconciliation, the aspect of healing is important. Yeah. So as much as, yes, we should remember, we should be able to remember and move on instead of holding on and saying that we can't forgive. We will have to, if we want to build nation building is about, there is an aspect, justice definitely is important, but there is an aspect of forgiveness and reconciliation that is needed. Thank you.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you so much for this nuanced answer and also assessment of the Indian engagement in Sri Lanka. And I think this brings us to, of course, a very difficult but also very interesting topic, and that is the topic of, well, disappointments and maybe things that did not work out quite as anticipated and as planned, but nonetheless also did, well, provide some gains and successes. So I would like to pick up on that and actually ask a question to Professor Anjoo. So you brought in the Constitution and the transformative aspirations that have been enshrined in the Constitution, which was drafted over a lengthy and fairly participatory process, and which really had very high ambitions regarding very deep-seated also social transformation. You mentioned the directive principles of state. Professor Gladstone brought in, of course, the work of Ambedkar, which connected grassroots and social movement activism with processes of lawmaking at the highest possible levels of the state. So I wanted to ask you, with the hindsight of 70 years, post-colonial statehood in India, how would you assess somehow the success and the challenges of law as a tool for conflict transformation and for transforming and overcoming some of these deep-seated and entrenched hierarchies that we have seen? And I would somehow like to put a follow-up question then also to the other members of the panel. In light of the tripartite ball that Florina has mentioned of rights development and healing, what other tools do we maybe need to draw on to engage in successful processes of conflict transformation? But yeah, first of all, over to you, Professor Anjoo.
Thank you. Thank you, Tobias. Thank you so much. If I may, I'm being informal because I think conversation happens with a better flow if we could be very, informal. The reason why I, emphasize upon the constitutional arrangements and upon the directive principles of state policies and the various legislations that took place is that they have a very norm-creating capacity. They kind of set standards, and these standards are then, referred to again and again by the activist community whenever they are denied. However, I wouldn't know how much time you'd give me to expatiate upon it. I could give you a small example now. For instance, the traditional approach to women's entitlement or property was that what was known as Istri Dhan. What is Istri Dhan? Istri is women and Dhan is property. Istri Dhan was looked upon in the scriptures, in the Hindu scriptures, as that property which was an inalienable right of women. Now that has been recognized by the legal procedures in independent India as well. What gets translated in practice is that the new entitlements of women that have been put in place, for instance, that of equal right to inheritance in landed property, including the agrarian property, has not been translated into practice because the society has not confirmed with that. And this is where the gap lies. This is where initiatives of people like us and people like Dr. Xavier's and Professor Xavier comes up. How to motivate people, how to motivate society into conforming to these norms. As a very renowned activist and an academic, Flavia Agnes, says that if we had to look at the legislation, social legislation of the country, we probably would be a very, very utopian state. We would be something which cannot even be dreamt of. But when we look at the reality in the society, there is much that needs to be still done. And that's where, your question about what impact it makes. So it's like, a constant effort to bring in place more equality, more inclusiveness, and more policies and more implementations of the same. For instance, again, bringing women in politics. For long years, after independence, although during the freedom struggle, women were very much on the forefront, as has been beautifully described by, in the history of doing, that women were almost, shoulder to shoulder, neck to neck, fighting for independence, especially after Gandhi came on the forefront. And they were, participating equally in the freedom struggle. The constitution was brought in place and women were given equal rights. But once independence was obtained, women were again almost, pushed back, not deliberately, but voluntarily, because seemingly the society again, did not expect them to come forward. And the portrait of an ideal woman was that you would be better off as an ideal wife or as an ideal mother. And this was then combated by those girls who were raised by these women during the Gandhian struggle with the notion that, well, before you're a woman, you're a person and you need to ask for your rights. And that's what explains the struggle throughout the 70s and the 80s. The wonderful volume that people like Veena Majumdar and her colleagues put forth in the book known as Towards Equality, of course, propagated by, or rather commissioned by the UN, wherein all these flaws, all these gaps were identified and efforts then started, being brought in place, ranging from encouraging awareness about women's rights and equality in the establishment of, say, for instance, women's studies centers all across the country, in a constant challenge to hackneyed laws, including judgments. So as late as 2013, after the very infamous Nirbhaya case, there was legislation that was brought in place to bring about amendments in the Criminal Procedure and the Evidence Act that made it probably easier or maybe not that shameful to, shameful of course is within quotes, to bring a particular case in the court of law. However, to say that everything has been fixed and now there is a law and there are activists, there are academics who are ensuring that things go smoothly from here, is probably asking for much more than what can be expected. We forget the gigantic, the huge canvas, the volume that India addresses. So whereas, for instance, in the case of minorities, we are identifying segments of minorities, we are not identifying so many others. But because India is a democracy, a liberal, plural democracy, on the one hand, of course, we find that caste tends at times to be the rope which so many political actors or agents start walking to ensure a closeness or proximity with the power centers. However, there's a constant effort to bring in more and more inclusiveness in this narrative. And this becomes all the more a very fascinating area of study. Of course, at times it is very depressing to see so many episodes of violence is still taking place against these people who were traditionally deprived, who were traditionally marginalized, and so much has been done for them, yet there is lots that can be done. But as an academic, it becomes a very, very insightful, journey to unravel these trajectories, to see what has been achieved and what is still to be achieved. So it's always, I wouldn't say it's like a myth of Sisyphus, but I would like to say that it is so many times you feel, well, there have been 3 steps forward and just about 2 steps backwards. At times you feel, no, there are 2 steps forward and 3 steps backwards. But for sure, I mean, if you look at the women's life expectancy, if you look at the so many millions of women now holding political power, what with the quota system being brought here, what with new pathways that women politicians have introduced to themselves or have gone to enter the portals of politics or political organizations. How many women are now entering even the armed forces, although here when we talk about peace, we're not mentioning armed forces, probably deliberately and rightly so. Peacekeeping. India was the first country to have brought in a total women contingent of peacekeepers across the world. So there have been strides that women have been making, and these strides need to be acknowledged. But then, as you say, women are not a very cohesive group. As I talk, I'm aware that my dinner is being cooked by some woman who's not perhaps as empowered as I am. And I'm aware that probably if she goes back to the village, maybe the so-called upper caste people will not allow her into the kitchen. So, I'm aware about this discrimination that prevails, and also extremely conscious. Professor Xavier talked about the impact of COVID, and he talked about the celebratory initiatives that have been taken by people. And one really, feels to kind of congratulate those who brought about these changes or these, welfare measures. However, one is also acutely conscious of the terrible violence that has happened during the corona, crisis, domestic on people who were literally shut in, and there was hardly any opening for them, and women and older people and disabled were the worst victims of these. So one can go on and on, as in the opening remarks Professor Upadhyaya said, that it'll take probably hours and hours to expatiate upon these issues. So these are some of the things that only some of them that one can highlight in this very short discussion. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And I would be delighted to go on for hours and hours and hours and continue the conversation. Unfortunately, we have a very limited window of time for our discussion here. And I would suggest before we maybe move more towards the international dimension, I have one follow-up question on the discussion we just started somehow on the, simultaneous inadequacy, but also indispensability of the law and legal reform and process of conflict transformation. So maybe one more follow-up question on a more domestic context. In the chat, one question was posed with a specific emphasis on rural areas and structural and cultural violence that is ingrained in social dynamics in particularly rural areas of the country, how they could be addressed in process of conflict transformation. I read the question to you to not misphrase it. So the question is, how does conflict transformation deal with the structural and cultural violence, especially in the rural setup? It is so deeply ingrained in the mindset of people, and I suppose the question implies that it needs specific kinds of approaches and engagements. And as well, Professor Gladstone has introduced himself as a field-working academic, and Professor Priyankar has, I just learned, engaged in very long-standing research in traditional, non-traditional conflict resolution mechanisms. I would like to hand this question maybe to both of you. Professor Priyankar, do you want to go first?
It's when I first of all, let me preface that when I hear about this distinction between academics and practitioners, I kind of feel uneasy, because those who do peace studies, in fact, we hardly mention we teach peace studies, because peace studies itself quite experiential. I mean, if you don't draw your examples, your theoretical understanding, you don't pin them down to the practice that you see around, nobody believes you. So, I mean, I think this distinction of peace studies being experiential and must draw on practice is very important. I think it is in this context that when we look at this particular very significant kind of query about what is happening at the rural areas, I mean, my own sense is that in India too, like in many other parts of large countries, the rural areas are also a very diverse set of domain, in the sense that there are areas which are extremely backward in terms of socioeconomic and cultural moorings. I mean, the Renaissance, if that is a word we can use, although I'm not very happy with that, or the transformations have not come about. I mean, say, for instance, talking about the region that we come from, I mean, the eastern Uttar Pradesh, it is one of the most backward area of the world, if I can say, in terms of, and very, very troublesome in terms of feudal and patriarchal and hierarchical values, which are still very dominant in the village side. Not to say that they don't reflect negatively in the so-called urban areas. And another category that's coming up very strongly is the urban sprawls. So you are neither a village nor a urban space, but so, you know, how does one really look at this question of structural violence is an issue that is kind of, I should say, that is being addressed through constitutional remedies, or we call it the traditional modes of this distinction, traditional, non-traditional modes of conflict resolution, and so on and so forth. Constitution ensures, and all the discussion, wonderful discussion we already have on board, the provisions of directive principles, the fundamental rights that allow, that kind of address the question of untouchability, for example, or the equality before law. But then I think the moot question is that of cultural violence. What about that ideology, the mindset that still doesn't allow us? I mean, there are grand examples, everybody is familiar that with the empowerment of women and with the joining of women, or the reservation of women at the Panchayat Raj level, I mean, the three-tier system that we talk about, we have a lot of these constituencies which are reserved for women. But even there, and even now, after so many years of this consciousness, a woman is elected, but then just, it's a namesake. The real governance is offered by her husband or her brother, and he has a very interesting address. I mean, he's called the woman is called Pradhani Pati, the husband of the, so, it's the mindset. The question is, what is happening, how to go about it? One very strong measure and vector could be education. But despite the fact that education could be very transformative, I think, and this is SDGs 4, or we don't have to mention that, everybody realizes that education can be very transformative, and but then the quality of education is very poor. I mean, if you look at the school, I don't think that the girl child or anybody studying there would acquire that kind of value system, that kind of knowledge. And with all the transformative ideas which are there in Gandhi, Ambedkar, and you have it in every region, you have these heroes, and their ideas can be very useful in transforming the way people think. The point is that even now, 70 years, 75 years past independence, in rural areas, in many regions, people are still mired in the sense of diffidence. I mean, in many areas in South and other ways, you find that there is a backlash, or there is an effort to claim your rights. But here, in my part of the world, if I can say that what we observe here is still that assertion for right, assertion for equality is very diminished. And that is precisely because of this cultural violence issues. The ideologies still prevail, the high caste and politician. All political parties, a couple of exceptions, and those parties are nowhere, they use caste as a factor. When you use caste as a factor, in a way, you legitimize that kind of cultural violence. And then begets the question that what kind of democracy are we in, where the caste still decides who's going to rule the country. So these are difficult issues to deal with. And my own sense is that it's a very pertinent question that, well, constitution is there, governance is there, and all the transformative ideas are there. But how do you inculcate those sense of confidence? That's very central to me, sense of assertion of one's right in that, in the rural areas, rural setup, whether it is women, minorities, and so on and so forth. But I think the practitioner colleague of mine can, answer it better than this, talking about from the ground reality. We observe, and sometimes we try to intervene and at least inspire that kind of action. But as they say that evergreen is the tree of life. I mean, you learn so much from the practice. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for the thoughts. Professor Gladstone, do you want to?
Just a couple of lines. Professor Priyankar has given a very, very good background to it. Now, what we suffer from is a kind of polarization and lumpenization of a traditional mindset, which is structured in violence. So violence is actually inbuilt into it. And there are definitive roles which caste and religion are emphasizing, and they don't allow you to get out of that. And that's what structure is. Now, to break that, you have to actually start from all directions. It's kind of multi-dimensional approach. You cannot start from top to down. You cannot start from down to up. You cannot start from right to left. It has to happen simultaneously. And this pressure can happen only when a critical mass is created to deal with that. Like in villages that we work in, very rural areas, as he rightly pointed out, there is a panchayat leader, and there's a police inquiry that comes to me because we had exposed an abuse of a child. And the police inquiry comes to me, and the policeman over the phone asks me to talk to the panchayat leader. The panchayat leader, he speaks to me and says he's a man. A man speaks to me. I said, the panchayat president of that village is a woman. And who are you? He said, sir, no, sir, I am her husband, sir. I am the acting leader, sir. I said, but you're not the elected man. You're not the elected person. Can I talk to the panchayat leader actually? Now, what is happening over here is this whole notional acceptance. And second is the idea of looking beyond the veil is missing. So there's a veiled approach to it. You're seeing from within the veil. If you take off the veil and if you're willing to expose your face, then there is a different way. Now, this dealing with structural violence in rural India is very, very difficult. And it's almost, it was unimaginable till recently. But now slowly it is happening. The quarrying is happening. The quarrying very, very slowly it will happen. But then these are not 1 or 2 years of injustice, thousands of years of discrimination. That need not take thousands of years to perish, need not. And if the implementation of it is right, and then if you're able to transcend the boundaries of caste and religion, then things can happen in a more rapid way. Final point is that when we are talking about assertion of rights, we need to train people to assert their rights and also train people to accept those rights and partake in the rights. So if a family, if a child in a family is malnourished, we should not feed only the child. We should feed the parents, feed the whole community. Then the community transforms. If you don't have that approach and feed only the child may improve, that one child may improve, but all the children around will not improve. So it is important to look at an attempt of empowering. That's why rural education is really important. Rural education with equity and access. Equity and access, equitable and accessible education at all levels are very, very important. Now, having said that, the bottom line of this is, how do we ensure in this? It's definitely investment in human resources. Structural change cannot be brought about without investment in human resources, which is for the long-term future.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you very much. Anjoo, you would like to add a few sentences, you said.
Very well said, Professor Gladstone. I would just like to add a couple of sentences to this, saying that yes, education is extremely important, and I don't know why politicians do not look at just about 2 decades and they can transform the entire composition of the nation if there is education, standard education, and of course health. But we cannot wait till everybody gets the proper education. And here, women might be speaking, might be behind the veil, but then don't we have examples of, say, for instance, MKSS in Rajasthan, where women came out and spoke behind the veils. One of the articles that is a part of a book that we are editing is entitled "Speaking Behind the Veil," and we see n number of women who in Rajasthan who actually are not taking off their parda, as we call it, and they are claiming "Hamara paisa, hamara hisab." And very recently, you talked about the peasant protest movement happening currently, and there was a very interesting expression of 4 words there in Punjabi, which said "Hamara hak itthe rakh," like keep my right here. And this is coming from a woman who's not very well educated or doesn't have even a high school or so. What I'm saying is that knowledge definitely comes through the literate word, but we simply cannot wait till that happens. And you're very right when you say that motivation is something that is required, and that is a responsibility. Some of us have already, some of us like you both have shared already, and some of us here in the North are also trying to share it. So these were just some of the observations. Like, it's not all bleak everywhere as we're trying to show it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. We have a question by Richard Balthrop, I believe, who would like to pose the question live. So if I may ask the technical team to allow Richard to enter the virtual room and pose his questions. And Richard, may I ask you to quickly introduce yourself and maybe tell us to whom your question is addressed, if not to the whole panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tobias. Yes, my question is about mediation, which is an area in which I work, looking at peace processes in the Middle East and Africa, and sometimes Southeast Asia as well, considering Sri Lanka, as has been discussed. And mediation obviously has a relationship with conflict transformation. It's one way to look at it is it's upstream of conflict transformation if conflict transformation is considered to be downstream. So I wondered whether the speakers have any comments about the weaknesses or the strengths of the normative international approach to mediation. And what I mean by the normative international approach is the approach that is exemplified by the UN, for example, with its 2012 UN guidance for effective mediation, and exemplified by the mediation structures that have been set up within the UN and elsewhere, for example, the EU and the OSCE, and then some countries, Switzerland, Germany, Finland, and also some other regional organizations to some extent. So it's an open question to any of the panel who are interested. Any Indian perspectives you bring to this, to the subject of normative international approaches to mediation? Thank you.
Richard, thank you so much for this wonderful question. So this is a question about India. My connection was a bit bad, so I couldn't catch all of it. I hope you heard the question. Well, as far as I understood it, and what I got was that the question is to which extent India's approaches to the normative structure of international mediation might differ, what kind of like disagreements or alternatives there might be. Is there anybody who would like to comment on that question? Maybe Professor Priyankar, yes.
I should set the ball rolling, as they say. I mean, this particular problematic, like so many other issues in peace building knowledge or peace research, or even in international relations, is concerns to me. I mean, that's how I would like to look at it, or to begin with, is about the non-inclusion of local approaches to peace building. I mean, the idea of, I mean, I'm not an expert on mediation, but like all other peace researchers or people who, academics who are concerned with peace and conflict studies, I have tried to understand this mediation business, and it comes somewhere with the flavor of liberal peace building. I mean, the mediators generally seem to know it all. And then there is also a sense they follow the cultural trappings and moorings which are a part of their tradition, but not necessarily a part of the tradition in Asia, Africa, or different parts of the world where they are doing it. So and I think that's been very central to the concerns past 2 decades when we started talking about the local turn. I mean, the big deal was that should we not use the cultural inputs, the cultural methodologies, and say, for example, in India alone, there are many, many traditions of elders trying to bring conflicting parties and trying to resolve or manage the dispute. It has its own issues and problems. For example, there's a caveat here I would instantly like to use. In India, we have had this tradition of Nyaya Panchayat. I mean, the justice, this is an expression which was used earlier. Now, these elders, village elders, for instance, they would, of course, invite everybody and listen to their problems and then deliver a verdict. But the problem was that the composition of this Nyaya Panchayat was not always very fair. I mean, they would generally not have any women, and generally the dominant people would kind of occupy the seat. So here is the problem. I mean, culturally, this idea is welcome, but in practical terms, you see it defies the norms of democracy and constitutionalism. So like many other academics and practitioners, I have started thinking and arguing for some kind of hybrid of bringing together certain ideas which are globally accepted about human rights, about equality, about equity, and then trying to bring in the cultural sort of moorings. I mean, the other example, and we have heard only the more negative versions of it, the Khap Panchayat. This Khap Panchayat, I'm sure anybody who has worked on India would know that how cruel, ruthless, and negative they can be about women and their right to assert themselves. But not always. Some part of Khap Panchayat have delivered. It doesn't mean that I'm trying to justify the other thing. So I think at the end, when we look at this mediation as a possibility within your own society, or even across, I should say, we have to think about models that are, culturally contextual. And I think that makes a better sense, and many academics and practitioners have tried to do so. In terms of India trying its hands on mediation abroad, I think that's something that, we have tried and we've discussed. I just casually mentioned it in my opening remarks. In 50s and 60s, we find such examples where Indian concept of peaceful coexistence, and drawing from not only Gandhi, but from the larger cultural canvas of within which India perceived itself, was there. I mean, in 1954, when India, Krishna Menon, India's representative in India, was made the chief of International Control Commission to manage or to deal with the question of Vietnam, for instance. Suez crisis is an example, and so on and so forth. But then these ideas never got really firmed up. One way it was happening was through the framework of non-alignment, which, unlike what people think, was not simply an anti-Cold War kind of ideology. It had a strong third world post-colonial foundations. I mean, we need to remember, and I'm sure that mostly people have forgotten, that there were 5 countries they were designated as Colombo negotiating mediation team that tried to resolve India-China dispute 62 to 64. And people have forgotten it. But it was a novel attempt by the non-aligned countries to use very unusual kind of mediation techniques to bring India and China together. We can talk about it some other time, but these are sporadic examples. My sense is that we need to work very strongly and in a concerted manner to bring in these disparate and these diverse ideas of mediation, which are embedded in different cultures, and then kind of bring them together with the Western liberal peace building methods, which is, I'm not entirely against it, but I think that it has to be more culturally contextual. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Professor Priyankar. I fully agree that there's a very, very rich tradition of mediation and also diplomatic engagement that was specially developed during some of the non-alignment years, which has been largely forgotten, but offers a very, very rich resource and repertoire to also think through some of the more contemporary challenges as well this facing. And I do hope that maybe we have another chance at another point in time to discuss this as well. For now, our time is almost up, unfortunately. I think part of your answer already really went to the heart of the question of dialogue and the challenges and possibilities of dialogue, also in face of somehow unequal speaking positions, so to speak. Now, and the challenges of also entering into a dialogue with dominant peace building and conflict transformation paradigms, which I think we all agree is desirable, but not always quite so easy. And this, of course, has also been a central motivation behind not only this session, but the entire series organized by the Berghof Foundation, bringing different knowledge communities on conflict transformation together and to engage in a dialogical process of mutual learning. So my last question to all panelists before handing over to Janelle for concluding reflections would be how you envision the possibility of dialogue across different peace building communities in the future, and if you have any recommendations of how this dialogue might be conducted in a fruitful way. Now, these different communities might be both academic or practical, but they might also be geographically dispersed communities in the global north and the global south. If you would like to share any thoughts on that, we would be most grateful. And I would suggest maybe we start in the reverse order from which we started. So I would now hand over to Professor Gladstone to start. Sorry, I think, yeah.
Let me give you a few points. First is knowledge sharing and experience sharing. Knowledge and experience sharing, it can be very, very invaluable. And it is more through case studies, experiential case studies, could be through simulations, and it could be through publications. These are fundamental to any kind of experiential outcomes. Number 2 is always supporting each other, academically, intellectually, and financially, because most people do not have the luxury to sit and write or the luxury to share these things in public because they need resources. Whoever it is, people will need resources, any kind of resource. These days, to participate in public dialogue, we enable people by giving them a little bit of money to pay for the internet. So it's like that. Doesn't mean that, it's just an example I'm giving, but that's one different. We need to engage and share resources. Third, most importantly, it is to have an open-minded approach to dialogue. A dialogical response is to have an open-minded approach, whereas not sticking to our guns, but then just trying to move out of it, move out of our comfort zone and be more inclusive. So 3 things within that is inclusion of people with diverse experiences who are allowed inside the room to the table to talk. So next is access and reachability, allowing people to opening the doors to people so that people can come in. They can be disabled, they can be from different communities, faith traditions, anything, LGBTQ, whatever, bringing people inside. And finally, looking at an equal, equitable platform. So that equal and equitable platform can happen online now. It's not so difficult. So we can have that. So these are 3 areas which I propose to have more open-minded discussions and share information. Share information. Peace will grow only if it is shared. So let's grow peace.
Thank you so much. Dr. Florina.
Yeah, I was thinking in similar terms to Dr. Gladstone on dialogue, especially. One of the challenges that we have is having equals come to the table. Even coming to the table is a challenge, and then having people come to the table as equals. So my recommendation, or what I would like to draw and learn, is creating equals. How do we work with bringing people who are equal, or bringing people who are not equal to that state of equilibrium? And that leads me to talk about caste and gender. And these 2 things are something that we have always struggled with. And if I look at 2 problems in India, it's caste and gender. That's how I would look at it. And to see how we can work on these 2 areas, that is very important. And that comes from, again, education and livelihood, because when people are deprived of education and not having an opportunity for livelihood, that doesn't help them to climb the ladder of life. And again, another point that Dr. Gladstone Xavier already spoke about is research. And as a practitioner, I can say that there's so much of work that we do in the field, but somehow I won't say from my side that there is no resource, but there's just no time, or there is just no, and I think Professor Priyankar clearly said that we can't look at it as separate, yeah. But that is what we do sometimes, we just compartmentalize and say, okay, practitioners, we don't have time to write, we can't research, and then academicians, they only research and write. So I think that is something that we should be able to bridge that gap. I mean, I personally feel that should be able to bridge that gap and make sure that research feeds into field, and field work feeds into research and theories. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you so very much. Now, in light of the time, which is really running very, very fast, I would like to ask very, very brief statements from Anjoo and Priyanka.
Yeah, I mean, many of the things have already been said, except that, yes, there is a dearth of resource for people who are in academics, as well as who are doing activism, who are doing both, which most of us are, being peace researchers. What is important is to provide proper training, how to produce scientific, articles or books, and how to train the activists as well. So many of us who go into the field are themselves not trained. So there is a need for good training, and how to do good interventions, how to convince those who are at the policy level, at the policy implementation level, at the policy level. Till date, we get only at times, judgments that sound like a manual for how would a rape victim behave after the act, as if it is a manual on how should a rape victim behave. So, I mean, there has to be a theory, practice, policy loop, as we used to say some 30 years ago, and that still needs to be covered. So these are my very short comments there.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Professor Priyankar.
Right, just 2 or maybe 2.5 quick points. One is, I'd be very interested to finding out, I wanted more time, because we are currently working on a UNESCO-driven project on interreligious dialogue in everyday life. I mean, the sense is that against the typical interfaith dialogue participated by only usual suspects, we have to look for this interreligious, intercultural dialogue in everyday life. And this is a kind of inventory that we need to look for. And in doing this research, we have discovered the importance of public spaces. I mean, this whole trend for online dialogue, etc., all fine. I mean, knowledge changes, and with that, everything changes. But we are seeing the shrinking of these public spaces where people would dialogue naturally. I mean, I come from one of the oldest cities. There are many oldest cities claimed, but Varanasi is one of them. And the typical tea shops, for example, And there are classical studies to show that there has never been any communal or ethnic violence around. See, it kills anonymity. So we have to look for and guard and also research on the loss of public spaces in the present spree of globalization and marketization. Public spaces, interreligious, interfaith dialogue in its new forms, these are areas that we really need to look for if we really want to. And of course, building the public constituency, as my colleague said, that we need to bring them on the table first. So these are the things that comes to me. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. Okay, in light of time, I would just directly hand over to Janelle now for some concluding remarks and reflections. Thank you so much for your statements and the very inspiring discussion. Janelle, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Tobias, and thank you to all of the panelists. It is really quite an honor to be asked to give my reflections after an event like this. It's a pleasure to be here with you all, and it's a very humbling experience. Being on such a panel of distinguished individuals. We talked quite a lot today about the various Indian traditions that have affected conflict transformation in the country and worldwide. And there's so many rich traditions in India. There's a tradition of dialogue, there's a tradition of activism, there's a tradition of intersectionality, of justice. Religious traditions that have obviously had an impact on society and conflict transformation approaches. There's diplomatic engagement. So there, we're coming from a very, very rich culture that has a lot to offer the field of conflict transformation. And like I said, it's a bit humbling to be asked to speak about 3 points because there was so much discussed today that I would love to have more time to do so. But my task here today is to talk about how we can mutually learn from each other. So how mutual learning can be fostered across peace-building communities. And so I would like to focus on 3 specific points. One of them is something that Professor Priyankar spoke in depth about in his last comment, or second to last comment, about the indigenous approaches to conflict transformation versus the more modern conflict transformation approaches. And I think there's been a lot of work done on this, including some people on this panel, and I have a lot to say about it, but I'll keep it short. I found it really interesting what Professor Priyankar said about the peace and conflict studies being under the spell of Western knowledge systems. I think that the question here is really how do you bring in the indigenous ideas into contemporary conflict transformation? And this is a really complex topic, and I think that this deserves much more investigation worldwide, because anywhere in the world that has legal pluralism, that has a situation of legal pluralism, is dealing with these questions. How do you incorporate indigenous knowledge, indigenous systems of justice, indigenous systems of conflict transformation into the more modern day world? And I think on the one hand, advocates for these systems romanticize these systems a bit too much, while on the other hand, there's much demonization of these initiatives as well, because they're considered inclusive, they're considered anti-feminist. So we need to have a better nuanced understanding of the added value of these indigenous systems, but also understand that they're not uniform. India is remarkably diverse. So the indigenous systems of conflict transformation are not going to be the same from one region to another. So I think there needs to be a lot more investigation on the added value that these traditional concepts, these indigenous concepts of transformation can bring to us in the work that we do in the conflict transformation field. I'll leave it at that on that point. I think the second point I'd like to focus on is the idea of justice together with social cohesion. One of the things that Dr. Florina was speaking about was, dialogue, bringing people together to build the social cohesion of communities and reaching, using this tradition of dialogue, this rich tradition of dialogue to do so. On the other hand, there was a lot of talk about justice, the tradition of justice. So Professor Gladstone spoke about that. He said, be controversial, but use a justice framework to do so. And Dr. Anjoo spoke a lot about the policies implemented over the years in order to reduce marginalization and strive for justice. And sometimes I think the conflict transformation field struggles with these two concepts of social cohesion and justice as if they were mutually exclusive. And it isn't the case, and it certainly shouldn't be the case. And I think we see in India a much more complementary approach to these two concepts. And I think that we could learn quite a bit from that for our work at the Berghof Foundation, but also worldwide, anywhere where these two issues come together and are priorities for communities. And the last point I would like to bring up is something that I don't actually have a lot to say about, but something that really struck me in what Dr. Florina was saying, and that is the issue of healing. I think that the conflict transformation field is not making the issue of healing and the issue of trauma the priority that it needs to be. And I think that, as Dr. Florina said, there's a lot of trauma in this field. We're dealing with people who are struggling with violent conflict and have seen and experienced things that make them traumatized, and we're not addressing this, and we're not addressing this in the holistic manner that it needs to be addressed in. And as she said, if you're not healed, peace and development don't mean very much. So we need to develop a more holistic understanding of what it means to transform conflicts. And one very, very important aspect of this is to focus on the healing of these communities and these individuals. So I will leave it at that. I hope that I was able to summarize a bit of the most important points that, from my perspective. I'm sure that all of you potentially have other perspectives as well. And just maybe one last question to the panelists. If we get a chance to have another conversation, I would really be interested in hearing what the Indian traditions are for healing and for trauma. I think that would be a really interesting topic for the next panel discussion. So with that, I'd like to end this session, and I'd like to thank everybody involved, the very distinguished panelists, as well as Tobias for doing such a wonderful job at moderating this session. And of course, I'd like to thank all of my Berghof colleagues who are behind the scenes, taking care of all the technical aspects. And to you, all of the participants out there, thank you very much for joining us for this session. And we hope to see you again in the future.